In 285 BC, Demetrius's army, which had been starving from their long march across Anatolia, would now form up for battle. As Seleucus rode out in front of his army, he would plead with them to lay down their weapons and to surrender. Once Demetrius's starving army heard his cries, they would revolt against Demetrius. Seleucus's victory would be won without the loss of a man, and would prove the end of the antagonists' hope of reclaiming their empire. Demetrius would subsequently be exiled in Syria, where he would die 2 years later in 283 BC. Lysimachus and Pyrrhus, who had divided Macedon after their victory over Demetrius, had initially worked together to make large gains in Greece against Demetrius' son, Antigonus II. The two armies had reached as far south as Athens before turning back. But once the news of Demetrius' defeat and capture reached them, and the Antagonid threat had once again subsided, Lysimachus would immediately decamp his army and marched against Pyrrhus, who was camped at Edessa. Lysimachus first attacked his supply convoys, cutting off Pyrrhus' army from Epirus, before he would begin sending letters and holding conferences with the leading Macedonians. Lysimachus found it easy to convince the fickle people that had already betrayed Demetrius several years earlier, aided by the fact Pyrrhus was not Macedonian. He quickly corrupted them and won their loyalty. Once Pyrrhus realized the danger, he would depart with his Epirate forces and marched back to Epirus. Pyrrhus had lost Macedonia exactly as he had gained it, and Lysimachus's position in Europe was now stronger than ever. In Egypt, a succession crisis was erupting. Ptolemy I was nearing death and decided to name his younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, his heir, rather than the elder Ptolemy Keranos. Ptolemy I would die later in 282 BC and was succeeded by his son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, who would become Ptolemy II. The elder son would depart for Lysimachus's court in Thrace, hoping to gain support for his claim to the Egyptian throne. Though Lysimachus's court would be having its own crisis, Agathocles was the eldest and originally intended to be the successor of Lysimachus, and was greatly popular amongst his subjects. However, Arsinoe II, one of Lysimachus's wives, would accuse Agathocles of conspiring to overthrow Lysimachus in an attempt to position her own son, Ptolemy, as Lysimachus's successor. Subsequently, Agathocles was executed for treason. His widow Lysandra fled with their children and her brother Ptolemy Keranos to Babylon, hoping to join Seleucus's court for protection. Seleucus, seeing an opportunity to intervene in the conflict, would promise to help them. In the summer of 282 BC, Seleucus would muster his army and soon began marching upon Lysimachus's Asian territories. As Seleucus crossed the Taurus, he would easily conquer much of Asia Minor. Many of the cities willingly surrendered to him. Seleucus soon marched upon Sardis, the defense of which Lysimachus had entrusted to Theodotus, and held the Lysimachid treasury in Anatolia. Though after a short siege, Theodotus would surrender the city. Lysimachus's army, which had began marching south once they heard of the invasion, was now nearing Seleucus. Both armies would meet in the fields west of Sardis, near the small town of Corupedium. Both armies would deploy themselves in the standard Macedonian formation, with cavalry on the wings and their phalanx positioned in the center. Both Seleucus, who was age 77, and Lysimachus, who was 79, would command their own right wings, considered the position of honor for the Macedonians. It is also believed Seleucus had a large number of elephants, which would have been positioned in front of his line. As the battle began, the actual movements of the armies become unknown, as there was no historical sources that cover the battle in detail. Though it is obvious that Seleucus's forces soon gained the upper hand, driving Lysimachus's troops backwards, and soon the Lysimachid formation began to falter. It was at this moment that Lysimachus was struck with a javelin, thrown by a Heraclean soldier serving under Seleucus. Lysimachus would die instantly, and once the news would spread, his entire battle line would collapse. The Battle of Corupedium would mark the last time that two former officers of the army of Alexander would clash. Seleucus now proceeded to the north, aiming to cross into Europe at the Hellespont to gain control of Lysimachus's European possessions. Once Seleucus crossed into Europe, it had been the first time since he had crossed with Alexander 54 years ago, and now there was nothing preventing him from adding Thrace and Macedonia to his vast empire. However, as he was marching to Lysimachia, he would be assassinated by Ptolemy Ceraunus, who would quickly leave for Lysimachia and seize control over a part of Seleucus's army, which was already there. From there, he would march upon Macedon and secure control over what was formerly Lysimachus's European kingdom. Seleucus' son, Antiochus I, who was ruling the eastern half of the empire, would ascend to king. In a few years' time, the four major players of the Hellenistic world had all died: Demetrius in 283, Ptolemy in 282, and Seleucus and Lysimachus in 281. The age of Alexander's successors was over. Though Lysimachus's death would have undesired consequences, Lysimachus had spent his whole reign fighting incursions from the barbarians. But now, with his death and no strong army along the Danube, the barbarians would begin to raid and plunder deep into Greece and Asia, which the new age of kings would have to fight for their very survival.